There is a certain kind of mental fatigue that does not come from doing too much, but from thinking too much. And if you have experienced it, you will recognize how subtle it can be. Because on the surface, everything appears normal. Nothing particularly stressful is happening. And yet, your mind feels busy in a way that it is difficult to switch off. It often begins with something quite small. Perhaps a conversation that did not go exactly as you expected. A decision you have already made. Or even something you are planning to do later. And without consciously deciding to, your mind starts revisiting it, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, as though there is something more to understand. At first, it feels like you are simply being thoughtful, careful, responsible even. Because thinking things through is generally seen as a good thing. But after a while, you start to notice that instead of becoming clearer, you're becoming more uncertain. And instead of moving forward, you're staying in the same place mentally. That is the space I want to explore today. Because overthinking is rarely about lack of clarity in the situation. It is more about how we are relating to uncertainty within ourselves. Welcome back. I'm Bhavna, founder of the Inspirited Life Coach. And on this channel, we explore leadership, lifestyle, and personal growth in a more reflective way. Taking time to understand not just what we do, but why we do it, and how our internal patterns shape the way we show up in our everyday lives. If you think back to the last video, where we spoke about how much importance we place on what other people think, you will notice that overthinking is not very far from that experience. Because once you became aware of how you are being perceived, the mind naturally begins trying to analyze situations more carefully. Not necessarily to understand them, but to avoid getting something wrong. And that is where thinking slowly turns into overthinking. Not because something has changed externally, but because internally, there is now a greater need to feel certain. There is an interesting idea that Daniel Kahneman speaks about, where he explains that the mind prefers certainty so strongly that it will often create the illusion of understanding even when clarity is not actually there. And if you reflect on that for a moment, it becomes easier to see why overthinking feels so compelling. Because it gives the impression that if you just think a little more, analyze a little deeper, you will eventually arrive at the right answer. But what often happens instead is that you move further away from clarity. I began to notice this in my own life during my years working in operations, where thinking ahead was not optional, it was essential. Because decisions needed to be made quickly and often with limited information. And there was a constant need to assess, anticipate, and respond. Over time, that way of thinking became second nature, and for a long time, I saw it as a strength because it allowed me to stay prepared to manage situations effectively and to respond with control. What I did not realize at the time was that the mind does not always adjust its space just because the environment has changed. Even when there was no immediate urgency, no situation requiring analysis, my mind would continue operating in the same way, revisiting conversations, reevaluating decisions, and trying to refine things that were already complete. There were moments where I would find myself going back over something that had already happened. Not because there was anything to change, but because my mind was still searching for a better version of what had already taken place. And that is where it begins to feel heavy. Not because the situation itself is complicated, but because the mind is trying to resolve something that no longer exists. One of the reasons this happens is because the mind is not particularly comfortable with uncertainty. And when something feels incomplete or open-ended, it tries to fill that gap by thinking through every possible outcome, every possible response, every possible interpretation. It creates a sense that if you think about something long enough, you will eventually reach a point where everything feels clear and settled. But in reality, what often happens is that the thinking becomes repetitive rather than productive. And instead of clarity, you are left with more questions. There is also an element of control in this, because thinking gives the illusion that you are managing the situation, that you're staying ahead of it, even when there is nothing immediate to act on. And while that can feel reassuring in the moment, it also keeps you engaged in something that does not require your attention. Over time, this creates a kind of internal noise that becomes difficult to step away from. Because the mind keeps presenting new angles, new possibilities, new things to consider. What makes this particularly interesting is that overthinking is rarely a sign of confusion. In many cases, it is a sign of awareness. People who overthink are often perceptive, reflective, and capable of seeing multiple perspectives, which is a valuable ability. The challenge is not in the thinking itself, but in recognizing the point at which thinking has already served its purpose. Because beyond that point, it does not add clarity, it begins to dilute it. For me, this became clearer when I started noticing the difference between thinking that leads somewhere and thinking that simply repeats itself. There is a kind of thinking that helps you understand a situation, make a decision, or gain insight. And then there is a kind of thinking that circles back to the same point again and again and again without moving forward. Once I became aware of that distinction, I started responding differently to my own thoughts. Instead of following every thought, I began pausing and asking whether this was actually helping me or whether I was simply staying engaged out of habit. That pause created space. And in that space, I began to realize that not every thought needs to be explored. Some thoughts pass through without requiring attention, and the more you engage with them, the more they continue. Another shift came from bringing my attention back to what was actually happening in the present moment. Because overthinking almost always takes you away from where you are, either into something that has already happened or into something that has not yet happened. And when you return to the present, there is often a noticeable sense of calm. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer trying to resolve what does not need resolving. If this resonates with you, I would invite you to notice something the next time your mind begins to revisit repeatedly. Instead of trying to find the perfect answer, simply observe whether the thinking is moving you forward or keeping you in the same place. That awareness on its own begins to change your relationship with your thoughts. Because you're no longer automatically following them. You're choosing where your attention goes. And that is where clarity begins to return. Not by thinking more, but by recognizing when thinking is already done enough. If this is something you recognize in yourself, and you feel like overthinking has been quietly affecting your clarity, your decisions, or even your confidence, then this is exactly the kind of work I explore more deeply through my coaching and leadership sessions. These are not quick fixes, but reflective conversations that help you understand your patterns, create clarity, and respond more intentionally rather than getting caught in the same mental loops. If that feels relevant for you, you will find more details in the description. And if this conversation resonates with you, I would really like to hear your experience, because overthinking is something many people navigate quietly, and sharing perspectives often brings a different level of understanding. If you found this helpful, take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. And if you are interested in more conversations around self-awareness, leadership, and personal growth, consider subscribing so you can continue exploring these ideas with me. In the next video, we are going to look at something that often sits beneath overthinking, and that is self-doubt. Because many of the thoughts we revisit are not just about situations, but about how we see ourselves within them. Until then, simply begin to notice when your thinking starts repeating rather than progressing, and gently bring your attention back to what is real and present. Because clarity is not created by constant thinking, it is created by understanding when to stop. Stay tuned in for the next video. See you soon. Bye.